Hello and welcome to the ChinaPower Podcast. I'm Brian Hart, Deputy Director and Fellow of the ChinaPower Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm filling in for our usual host, Dr. Bonnie Lin. In this episode, we'll be discussing China's influence in the pharmaceutical industry and the geopolitical implications. How much leverage does China have over global drug supply chains, and how did it gain prominence in such a critical industry? How exposed are the United States and other countries, and what are the implications for U.S. economic and national security? To discuss these questions and more, we're joined by Dr. Yanzhong Huang. Dr. Huang is a Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he directs the Global Health Governance Roundtable series. He's also a Professor and Director of Global Health Studies at Seton Hall University's School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He's the founding editor of Global Health Governance, the scholarly journal for New Health Security Paradigm. Dr. Huang is also the author of multiple books and reports, including The COVID-19 Pandemic and China's Global Health Leadership, published in 2022. Dr. Huang, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I think a lot of listeners are probably not familiar with, the ins and outs of this industry. So maybe let's start with the basics. Can you give us a sense of how these global supply chains work? How do things like key starting materials and active pharmaceutical ingredients fit into the broader picture? And what are the other key steps in the drug making process that we need to know about?
Well, thank you, Brian. When talk about how global pharmaceutical supply chain work, think of making a pharmaceutical drug like building a car. So it's a complex, multi-step process that happens across different countries and companies. No single facility makes a complete medication from start to finish. So when we talk about the journey from chemicals to medicine, every drug starts with basic raw materials, often simple chemicals derived from oil, minerals, or plants. These get transformed through a series of chemical reactions into key starting materials we call KSMs, which are like the specialized parts needed to build the actual medicine. For example, to make penicillin, manufacturers start with fermented broth that get processed into specific chemical compounds. And from KSMs, companies create active pharmaceutical ingredients we call APIs. This is the actual therapeutic substance in drugs that produce the intended health effects. So the penicillin used to treat bacterial infection, the aspirin that relieves your headache, or the insulin that manages diabetes are APIs. Creating APIs requires sophisticated chemistry and extremely pure conditions, since even tiny impurities can be dangerous. And of course, before these steps, drugs undergo clinical trials to prove safety and efficacy, which determines whether APIs are scaled up for production. And beyond making these APIs, several other critical steps complete the journey, right? There is formulation and final manufacturing. There is quality control and packaging and distribution. So you might wonder why this is so spread out, right? This global assembly line exists because different regions develop expertise in different steps. Right? China became dominant in chemical manufacturing due to lower cost and fewer environmental regulations. India specialized in generic APIs. The US and Europe focused on research and high-tech manufacturing. So as a result, a single pill might have raw materials from Brazil, KSMs made in China, APIs produced in India, and final formulation in Ireland, and packaging in the US, and distribution worldwide. So this creates efficiency, but also risk. Disruption anywhere can affect patients everywhere.
Thank you. That really helped break down, this complex supply chain into some pretty short and easy to understand descriptions. So I think you kind of touched on this, but I want to zoom in specifically on China and how it fits into these supply chains. So where does it have the most significant influence? And is that kind of broad areas of influence, or is it more concentrated in certain areas? And do we even have clarity into this picture?
Well, we know that China has transformed from the so-called factory floor of global pharmaceutical manufacturing into a comprehensive pharmaceutical powerhouse that spans both traditional manufacturing and cutting-edge innovation. So its influence operates on multiple levels, right? From controlling essential chemical building blocks to emerging as a major biotech innovator. So in terms of traditional strongholds, right, China is still dominant. It controlled approximately 80% of the global generic API supply chain as of 2023. And in critical raw materials, it accounts for approximately 70% of global vitamin C output, 70% of citric acid output, and 90% of penicillin output. But here's what's changing rapidly. It now holds 23% of global next generation therapeutic candidates. That represents a dramatic shift from pure manufacturing to innovation. China's innovative drug sector saw over 110 drug approvals in 2024, with the market expected to reach 1.4 trillion yuan. That's approximately 194 billion US dollars in 2025. Right? So China's influence now spans from the most basic chemical inputs to advanced biologics and gene therapies. For example, it is the largest producer of 6-APA, the most important intermediate synthesis of amoxicillin and other semi-synthetic penicillin, with 80 to 90% of global production capacity. While in the meantime, it develops original CAR T-cell therapies and monoclonal antibodies, both forms of immunotherapy used to treat cancer. So when we talk about whether it has broader influence of all areas of the industry, or is the influence more concentrated in certain areas, but it is clear, right, that China's influence is no longer just concentrated, right? While its influence was historically concentrated in upstream manufacturing, it is rapidly expanding across the entire pharmaceutical value chain, right? So, when we talk about, that this innovative, this entire pharmaceutical value chain, right, it is while keeping its traditional manufacturing base, it is simultaneously building world-class capabilities in drug discovery and development, clinical trial infrastructure, complex biologics, manufacturing, advanced drug delivery systems, and precision medicine and genomics. Right? So unlike 5 to 10 years ago, China now competes directly with Western pharma companies across multiple segments. Its biotech firms now attracting global talent, raising substantial international funding, and advancing clinical trials at unprecedented speed. But the picture is becoming sort of more complex, not clearer, right? We don't have a clear understanding, and the rapid changes only make the picture even murkier, right? Western companies do not have a great degree of visibility to understand potential supply issues, and this challenge is compounded by China's expanding role. There is, for example, a wide range of reported U.S. reliance on Chinese-made APIs, from 8% to 47%. A recent Brookings report suggests the U.S. exposure to Chinese APIs is likely less than 25% of the API production stage volume. But this is not surprising because supply networks those companies depend on are extensive, intricate, and often opaque. But this opacity now extends beyond manufacturing into R&D partnerships, licensing deals, and innovation ecosystems. Indeed, while we're still mapping the traditional supply chain dependencies in APIs and KSMs, now these dependencies are emerging in biotech innovation, clinical trial data, and advanced manufacturing capabilities. For example, Chinese companies like Wuxi Apotek, it now designs and manufactures drugs for Western companies. It develops up to estimated 25% of drugs used in the United States. So they don't even just know how to make your medicine. They helped invent it. So the old metrics are becoming rapidly outdated.
Thank you. I want to home in a little bit on how China got here and how it became so prominent. We've heard this story in a lot of different industries where China steadily gains market share, as countries outsource different parts of the supply chain to China. What does that picture look like here in the specific pharmaceutical industry? What did China do to really target this industry? Has Beijing, policymakers in Beijing really targeted this in specific ways? Could you give us more of a sense of that?
Great questions. Well, China's rise in pharmaceuticals indeed follows the classic outsourcing playbook, but with a twist, right, recently. So they didn't just become the world's cheap factory. They now become the world's innovative pharmacy. Like, with sneakers and smartphones, right, it started with Western companies, chasing lower costs. According to a 2009 World Bank paper, if a Western pharmaceutical company has a wage index of 100, Chinese companies clock in at just 8. We see the big difference, right? So add cheaper electricity, water, and fewer environmental regulations for handling toxic chemicals, and you've got a compelling cost story, right? But pharma had unique vulnerabilities. So unlike making toys, pharmaceutical manufacturing involves complex multi-step chemical processes. Right? So once Pfizer, for example, approves a Chinese supplier to make their blood pressure medication, switching suppliers means years of regulatory approval and millions in costs. Right? So this created a so-called pharmaceutical lock-in that doesn't exist when making iPhones. And today, switching away from Chinese supplies isn't just expensive. It's actually almost impossible. Take vitamin C production. China now controls 70% of global supply. So even if you wanted to build a vitamin C plant elsewhere, you'd need Chinese raw materials, Chinese trained chemists, and years to recreate their integrated supply chains. There is also the chemical park advantage in China, right? It built integrated chemical industrial parks where all the supplies cluster together. Right? So if you need a starting material for your antibiotic, it's made next door. You need an intermediate compound, that's across the street. The Chinese firms have lower shipping and transaction costs for raw materials because everything is co-located in massive industrial complexes. Right? At Shanghai Chemical Industrial Park, SCIP, within 29.4 square kilometers, you will find some of the best-known Chinese and international chemical companies, such as Sinopec, BASF, Covastro, Evonik, Huntsman, Mitsubishi Gas Chemical, right? Mitsui Chemicals. You can't really compete with China on that, and then when we talk about the government support, right, there is a fundamental departure from the traditional outsourcing model that occurred in 2015. This year, as you may know, Beijing launched this industrial strategy, Made in China 2025. That targeted life sciences for global leadership. Right, it set specific targets. By 2025. The goal was for Chinese companies to develop 20 to 30 innovative drugs and to pass FDA certification for 5 to 10 new drugs. So that strategy provided massive state funding, regulatory reforms, and infrastructure development that essentially transformed China from a generics producer into a biotech innovator. You might call it a biotech giant capable of competing globally. And then you take a regulatory reform, right? Starting the same year, right, under Beijing Chang, then head of the China's FDA. China overhauled their drug approval system, streamlined approval process, reduced the cost of domestic drug development while bringing their regulatory framework in line with global standards. So suddenly, Chinese companies could get innovative drugs approved faster and cheaper at home, than Western companies could in their own markets. So there was, and of course, there was also this talent revolution, right? China embraced, as you know, this 1,000 talents plan, recruiting Chinese scientists back from abroad. For a time, like in Beijing only, right, 44% of returnees to Beijing were scientists working in life sciences. So picture a Merck scientist who moved to Shanghai, bringing like 15 years of big pharma experience to train local teams, and multiply that by thousands. So to quickly, right, the sum up by China essentially, they weren't just making drugs cheaper, they were making drug discovery faster. And by making biotech a top priority, the China biotech ecosystem is now thriving, with a number of domestic innovative drugs approved in China, which is 39, essentially surpassed that of foreign companies, which is 30 for the first time in 2021.
Thank you. That's a really helpful point, I think, specifically about how just the precision that's needed with a lot of these chemicals and drugs just enhances the fact that once you make those investments in China, it's even harder to pull out. I want to turn now specifically to the implications of this for the United States. You've touched on this a little bit, but I want to focus on, how reliant is the United States on China for different parts of the supply chain? Are there any areas, certain drugs, APIs, or precursor chemicals where the U.S. is particularly dependent on China? Are there particular areas we need to be worried about?
Yes, the United States pharmaceutical supply chain, well, we know they have grown increasingly vulnerable due to heavy reliance on foreign manufacturing, with China emerging as a pivotal player. As of 2025, this year, amid escalating trade wars and tariffs, U.S. imports of pharmaceuticals reached more than 800,000 metric tons. That is 7 times the volume in 2000. And China and India supply over 57% by weight. And in the meantime, about 70 to 80% of the APIs for generic drugs come from just 2 countries, again, India and China. Direct imports from China constitutes about 6% of finished products, ranking it 4th after Ireland, Germany, and Switzerland. But indirect exposure through intermediaries like India amplifies this to potentially 25% or more for critical components. And recent analysis, like the recent Brookings Institution report, debunk a myth of a total dominance, highlighting target vulnerabilities. So if we break down the supply chain, it actually reveals varying degrees of reliance. Look at raw materials and precursor chemicals. There's clear high dependence. Because approximately 45% of key starting materials estimated to be solely sourced from China. And then if you look at active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, the risk is moderate to high, with nearly 30% of the US APIs sourced from China directly, rising to over 60% when including India-sourced APIs that originate in China. When you look at intermediaries, it's similarly high, the risk, That is often integrated with KSMs, the key starting materials, where China's vertical integration dominates multi-step synthesis, for cost-sensitive drugs. And then you look at the finished dosage forms, the risk is from low to moderate direct reliance, around 6%. But many US or India labeled products incorporate Chinese APIs, so that increases hidden risks. And finally, if you look at packaging and supplies, the risk is high for critical items like PPE, vials, with over 50% from China. That exacerbates vulnerabilities during crises. But when we look at those certain areas where the U.S. is particularly dependent on China, there are several pharmaceutical areas where the U.S. exhibits acute dependencies on China. Particularly when we talk about generics, antibiotics, and essential precursors, China's market share often exceeds 70 to 90%. So these key high dependence areas include antibiotics. Nearly 90% of the U.S. antibiotic APIs, such as those for penicillin, doxycycline, and cephalosporins, come from China. So this near monopoly threatens infection treatments, that was evidenced by shortages during geopolitical tensions. And then there's vitamins and over-the-counter drugs. over 75% of the imports for vitamins, we talk about B1, B6, B12, CE, and APIs by the acetaminophen and ibuprofen originated in China. That affects everyday health products like Tylenol and Advil, right? Then blood thinners, heparins, by the raw materials and APIs are predominantly Chinese source, right? Chinese pig herds are estimated to supply about 80% of crude heparins used in the United States. So that is so because almost half of the global pig supply is in China, right? And the names continues, right? The list continues, right? The oncology and cardiovascular drugs, right? APIs for chemotherapy agents and heart medications show surging imports, the 400%, 1,000 growth since 2017. Generic drugs, right, broadly, right, encompassing 90% of the prescriptions. Many of for hypertension and diabetes rely on Chinese KSMs and APIs. And then precursor chemicals, right? We know, right? China played a key role, right? And there's the synthetic opioid precursors, right? That fuels the U.S. fentanyl crisis. Really, we're talking like there's in several of these pharmaceutical areas, the U.S. exhibits right, acute dependencies on China.
Yeah, thank you. I think you also mentioned, PPE, personal protective equipment, and crises, which obviously brings to mind the COVID-19 pandemic. So I wanted to touch on that briefly. You've cited in some of your work that there was a moment during the pandemic when China threatened to cut off exports of active pharmaceutical ingredients to the United States in retaliation for travel bans. Can you tell us more about that and just how the pandemic shaped U.S. concerns about China's threats to this industry?
Well, the incident you mentioned occurred in early March 2020. That was amid escalating tensions between the U.S. and China over the origins and handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Right? It stemmed from a U.S. travel ban imposed by the first Trump administration on January 31st, 2020, that restricted entry from China to curb the virus spread. But Beijing viewed this as an overreaction and a form of scapegoating. So in response, Chinese state media amplified the rhetoric blaming the U.S. for politicizing the crisis. So on March 4th, 2020, the state-run Xinhua news agency published an article suggesting China could impose export controls on pharmaceuticals as retaliation. So the piece basically said, if China retaliates against the United States at this time by banning exports of masks and pharmaceutical products, the United States will fall into what they call the hell of COVID-19. Right? They also noted that most U.S. drugs are imported and heavily relied on Chinese APIs. And of course, no actual export ban on APIs or drugs were enacted. China instead focused on resuming production and exports amid a global demand, even though by disruptions from factory shutdowns in Hubei province did cause temporary shortages of PPE, right, APIs, and finished drugs worldwide. But the COVID-19 pandemic and China's threat to weaponize its control over PPE and APIs essentially dramatically amplified the U.S. anxieties about the dependence on China for pharmaceuticals, transforming what was previously a niche supply chain issue into a national security priority. U.S. lawmakers, including Senator Marco Rubio at that time, highlighted it as evidence of Beijing's willingness to weaponize its pharmaceutical dominance. So you see some very important change, right? So prior to 2020, before the pandemic, concerns did exist, right? But the Xinhua incident crystallized fears, that Beijing could use its dominance as strategic leverage in trade wars or conflicts. So this echoed broader U.S.-China tensions, including tariffs and accusations of intellectual property theft, and leading to the views of pharmaceuticals as a critical supply chain at risk from foreign threats. Right? So the crisis spurred immediate actions, such as Trump administration's August 2020 executive order, essentially directing the FDA to reduce dependence on foreign manufacturers, for essential medicines and establish a stronger domestic market. So it also invoked the Defense Production Act to boost the U.S. manufacturing of PPE and APIs. And in the meantime, the threat of supply chain disruption also prompted the ongoing vulnerability assessments, stockpiling initiatives, and alliances for nearshoring. There was bipartisan legislation, like proposals for tariffs on Chinese medications to incentivize onshoring.
Great. So we've seen China threaten some of these activities. Are there any concrete instances of China actually withholding anything, for geopolitical implications or reasons? And what role, if any, has pharmaceuticals played in the ongoing U.S.-China trade war?
Well, I think, we like to talk about, right, this rare earth moment, right, when China uses control of rare earth to gain leverage in trade talks with the United States. But I think unlike rare earth, where China holds near absolute dominance, pharmaceuticals, reveal sort of genuine two-way dependence, that probably deterred China from using its dominance in pharmaceuticals to, actually use that to gain leverage, right, with the United States, in strategic competition or trade talks. We know that the U.S. companies now control more than 65% of China's immunological products market. China's imports of the U.S. pharmaceuticals increased by nearly 2,700% since 2017. So that means the U.S. companies now control more than 65% of this $7.9 billion import market. So that, in my opinion, creates a fundamentally different dynamic than China's recent move to impose new rare earth controls against the United States. So, when Beijing threatens API cutoffs, right, the risk is this American retaliation that could deny Chinese patients access to cutting-edge cancer treatments, advanced biologics, and breakthrough therapies, where the U.S. still accounts for 36% of patented APIs compared to China's 9%. So that is genuine mutual vulnerability, in my opinion. Not the one-sided leverage China enjoyed with rare earth. Right? So in other words, China hasn't actually weaponized pharmaceuticals yet, not because they lack capability. It's essentially a strategic calculation, right? The actual implementation would have triggered retaliation that hurt Chinese patients who depend on American innovations. But here is where it's gets concerning, right? So that protective interdependence now is rapidly eroding, right, in China's favor. It now holds 23% of global next-generation therapeutic candidates. That represents a dramatic shift from manufacturing to innovation. So as Chinese biotech capabilities advance, their vulnerability to U.S. pharmaceutical retaliation also decreases. That makes a weaponization more likely.
Thank you, Dr. Huang. I think that comparison to rare earths is a really useful comparison to show how it's different and not exactly applies in the same way. Moving on to, I think, close out with the final question. What are the U.S. options here? What does a credible strategy for resilience look like in this space? Is reshoring an option? Are there allies and partners that we can turn to more, or are there any easy solutions here?
Well, great question, right? When we talk about the alternative sources, the mitigation, it's actually more complicated than we thought, right? India looks like an obvious backup plan that supplies 65% of the U.S. generic solid oral drugs. But here is the kicker, right? It relies on China for 68 to 75% of its APIs. So if China cuts off KSM's key starting materials, Indian production collapses too. It's like having a backup generator that uses the same power grid. And then you look at Europe, right? European countries are strong, in biologics and some high-end APIs, but they are not set up for the bulk generic chemicals where China dominates, right? Germany and Switzerland could pivot to generics, but the cost are just brutal. We're talking, again, 30 to 40% higher than Chinese prices. Well, Mexico, this is what gets interesting, right? It is becoming, right, it is a promising nearshoring option. And there are indeed some U.S. investments there, but it's not at scale yet. There's some strategic API reserve exists, but in the U.S., but it sits at just 1% capacity as of 2024. So again, right, when we talk about the options the United States has, it's quite limited. Oh, I forgot to mention, right, the reshoring, right? That's definitely an option, but not a silver bullet, right? On this plus side, it's gaining serious traction. Pharmaceutical firms are pouring billions into U.S. facilities, right? And the tech angle is promising, right? The advanced manufacturing, like continuous flow processes, could rebuild domestic API and KSM production. But here's the reality check, right? The hurdles are brutal, right? And real. China's prices are basically sub-rational, right? Due to their cost advantages. Building new plants takes 5 to 10 years. The regulatory hurdles make everything tougher. Again, Chinese companies operate with a wage index of just 8 compared to Western companies at 100. So the smart play isn't reshoring everything, right? That's neither feasible nor necessary. A strategic de-risking approach would focus on targeted reshoring for high-risk items, rather than everything, and think antibiotics for biodefense, right? Essential hospital drugs, and medications where single supplies dominate. We focus on those issues. For everything else, diversification, beats expensive domestic production. And so the bottom line is that we need a solid strategy that blends, for real agility, but it needs, serious funding and bipartisan commitment. So the goal is not a pharmaceutical autarky, right? It's creating enough alternatives that China's leverage becomes manageable. So if Beijing knows that restricting pharmaceutical exports would inconvenience rather than cripple United States, the threat loses its power. That's how you build a credible deterrence, right? Not by cutting all ties, but by ensuring those ties can't be weaponized effectively. So that is similar to what we in the global health field called the deterrence by denial, right? We handle the threat of biological warfare, right? Which is very different from the mutual assured destruction logic in nuclear deterrence.
Well, as is so often the case, there's no easy answers. But thank you so much for providing some helpful thoughts on what maybe makes sense for a strategy. This is such a complex and technical issue. So it's been great having you join us and really break down these issues into simpler terms to help us understand. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.